I'm Chase Lewis, a 45-year-old senior IT manager at Northgate Solutions. For the past 17 years, I've dedicated myself to mastering the intricate architecture of our proprietary network infrastructure. Over the years, I've become intimately familiar with every layer of the system, from the physical hardware connections to the software protocols that drive over 60% of our company's critical operations. My role wasn't just about maintaining uptime. It involved designing resilient, scalable systems that could adapt to our rapidly evolving business needs, while protecting proprietary intellectual property crucial to our competitive advantage. Throughout my tenure, I gained a reputation for precision and thoroughness. Every project I led was documented meticulously. Detailed network diagrams, exhaustive change logs, encrypted backups, and emergency protocols. To me, documentation wasn't just a bureaucratic task, it was a strategic asset. I understood that in complex systems like ours, the smallest undocumented change could cascade into major failures. This attention to detail earned me the trust of executive leadership and several promotions over the years. That morning, I was summoned to a meeting with Martin Caldwell, our Chief Financial Officer. Martin and I hadn't interacted much beyond occasional budget discussions, but he was a decisive figure, especially since the announcement of the merger with our parent company. The merger had created a tense atmosphere, with rumors of restructuring and layoffs circulating quietly through the ranks. Despite the uncertainty, I had confidence in my position. My expertise and years of irreplaceable institutional knowledge made me a cornerstone in the company's future plans, or so I thought. When I entered Martin's office, he was seated behind a polished desk, a termination letter lying flat in front of him. His expression was unreadable, almost clinical. Without preamble, he said, "Chase, this is due to budget cuts. We have to let you go effective immediately." He slid the letter across the desk and, without waiting for a response, added, "Turn in your badge on the way out." His tone was firm, void of sympathy or negotiation. I took the letter silently and read through the formal language. No severance, no transitional support, just an abrupt termination clause. Internally, I processed this with a calm, analytic mindset. My years in IT had taught me the value of detachment in the face of unexpected turmoil. I nodded once, steady and composed, and said plainly, "Understood." I collected my personal effects and handed in my badge as instructed, noting the precise time and the names of the HR personnel who processed my exit. What might have been an emotional moment for others was, for me, a calculated pivot point. That evening, back at home, I sat down with the emergency file I had been required to maintain for years, a comprehensive, secured archive containing system architecture diagrams, critical passwords, backup procedures, and an encrypted log of all operational changes. This file wasn't a mere formality. It was a living document designed for emergencies, precisely the kind of crisis I now faced. As I opened the file, I began cross-referencing the termination letter with my employment contract and severance clauses, noting immediate discrepancies. I reviewed network dependency diagrams to confirm my unique role in managing proprietary systems. The more I looked, the clearer it became that this termination wasn't just a budget cut. It was a calculated move to sidestep contractual obligations and seize control over intellectual property without due compensation. The threads started pulling apart a fabric of deliberate deception that I knew I could unravel methodically. This initial moment set the stage for a deeper investigation, a strategic confrontation grounded in documented facts and professional acumen rather than emotion or impulse. The situation was precarious, but I was prepared to leverage everything I had built over 17 years. The merger was far from settled, and the real challenge was just beginning. Over the course of 17 years at Northgate Solutions, my career was defined by a combination of deep technical expertise and an unwavering commitment to precision. Early on, I recognized that managing complex network infrastructure wasn't merely about keeping servers online or troubleshooting connectivity issues. It was about architecting systems that could evolve with the company's business demands while safeguarding proprietary technology. One of my proudest achievements was leading a multi-phase initiative to streamline our data centers, which ultimately saved Northgate an estimated $2.3 million in operational costs. This project involved consolidating multiple legacy data centers scattered across various sites into a centralized, virtualized environment. The consolidation reduced physical hardware requirements, dramatically lowered energy consumption, and improved overall system reliability. But the real challenge, and where my expertise came into play, was ensuring that this transformation preserved data integrity and maintained uninterrupted service for mission-critical applications. To achieve this, I meticulously documented every step: network topologies, system configurations, backup schedules, and failover protocols. These records became invaluable not just for ongoing maintenance, but also for rapidly diagnosing potential issues, a practice I insisted upon from day one. Beyond infrastructure, I was responsible for the proprietary system architecture that underpinned roughly 60% of Northgate's daily operations. This system wasn't off the shelf. It was custom-designed software, integrated closely with our hardware, managing internal workflows, client data processing, and security controls. My approach combined software engineering principles with systems administration, ensuring the architecture was both scalable and secure. I routinely updated architecture diagrams, outlining dependencies between modules, data flows, and access control levels. These diagrams were more than technical blueprints. They were strategic assets that demonstrated the complexity and intellectual property value embedded in the system. My role also extended into client-facing responsibilities. By maintaining strong relationships with key stakeholders, I helped ensure that our systems aligned with client needs and compliance requirements. This trust translated into stable contracts, generating upwards of $18 million annually. Being the primary technical liaison, I coordinated with account managers to address client concerns promptly and adapt system capabilities proactively. The high stakes reinforced my dedication to thorough documentation. Every change request, update, or incident report was logged with timestamps and impact assessments. This habit of rigor wasn't universally appreciated. Some colleagues considered it tedious or excessive. However, I understood that in a high-risk, highly regulated environment, such records were essential safeguards. Through the years, my reliability and the consistent quality of my work earned me 3 promotions, each accompanied by increased responsibility and, naturally, a higher salary. My compensation package included vested benefits, notably a severance agreement promising $350,000 after 15 years of service, a clause I had reviewed carefully and kept accessible in my personal records. Given the competitive market and Northgate's valuation of institutional knowledge, my package was commensurate with my expertise, but also made me a target amid the cost-cutting pressures accompanying the merger announcement. While others focused on quarterly results or short-term metrics, I focused on building durable systems and documenting everything. I maintained daily logs of network performance, encrypted nightly backups, and regularly updated the emergency file mandated by company policy, an archive containing critical system passwords, architecture diagrams, contingency plans, and access credentials. This file was designed to be a single source of truth for any IT emergency, ensuring continuity even in my absence. I took this responsibility seriously, updating it after every significant change, running regular audits to verify accuracy, and securing it under multi-factor encryption with dual authentication protocols. Looking back, I realize how these professional habits, developed from necessity and pride in craftsmanship, became the foundation for what was to come. They were not just technical artifacts, they were strategic tools that would enable me to navigate the complex legal and corporate challenges that awaited. While the company might have seen me as a line item to cut, I knew my value was embedded in systems, contracts, and documented proof, not in fleeting office politics or empty promises. As I processed the termination letter that morning, the dissonance between my years of contribution and the abrupt dismissal struck me sharply, but not enough to break my composure. Instead, I viewed the situation as a problem to be solved, with documentation as my evidence and strategy as my weapon. The next steps would require leveraging every detail I had gathered over nearly 2 decades of service, turning a professional betrayal into an opportunity for accountability. The foundation was laid. My documented history at Northgate was more than a resume. It was a dossier, meticulously compiled and ready to expose the truth behind the so-called budget cuts. The stakes were high, but I was equipped. Martin Caldwell, the CFO, was a man under immense pressure. The merger with our parent company wasn't just a simple acquisition. It was a complex financial and operational restructuring designed to create a leaner, more competitive enterprise. From the outset, Martin's mandate was clear: slash costs aggressively to appease shareholders and demonstrate rapid synergy gains. High-salary veterans like me, with long-standing contracts and vested benefits, were immediate targets in his cost-cutting blueprint. Martin's strategy was painfully straightforward: replace experienced high-cost personnel with less expensive, less tenured staff, people easier to control and with fewer contractual obligations. He believed this would accelerate integration while reducing overhead. Derek Stanton, a relatively inexperienced IT manager, known more for his corporate loyalty than technical depth, was chosen as my replacement. Derek's onboarding was fast-tracked, deliberately bypassing the usual knowledge transfer protocols. It was a calculated risk on Martin's part. He assumed the proprietary system's complexities could be grappled with over time, or worse, that any operational hiccups would be tolerated in the interest of cost savings. What Martin failed to anticipate was the depth and exclusivity of my knowledge, along with the strategic value of the documentation I maintained. Over the years, I had developed and preserved an emergency file that contained detailed system architecture diagrams, comprehensive network dependency maps, critical access credentials, and operational continuity plans. This wasn't just technical minutiae, it was the core intellectual property that kept 60% of Northgate's operations running smoothly. Without this file and the associated knowledge, system management would be precarious, risking client dissatisfaction and regulatory scrutiny. More importantly, Martin overlooked the legal frameworks underpinning my employment. My contract included a severance clause guaranteeing $350,000 after 15 years of service, a provision he deliberately chose to ignore in his termination approach. Internal emails I later reviewed exposed a concerted effort on Martin's part to conceal this obligation from senior management and HR. The intention was clear: sidestep severance payouts and appropriate the proprietary knowledge embedded in my systems without compensation or acknowledgement. The risk extended beyond personal grievance. Martin's rush to restructure ignored critical regulatory compliance issues tied to employment law and merger protocols. Employment contracts like mine, especially with severance guarantees tied to non-compete clauses, required explicit disclosure and negotiation during mergers. His failure to comply with these obligations exposed the company to potential audits and penalties from labor authorities. Likewise, mismanagement of proprietary information during a merger breached securities regulations, which could trigger investigations by the SEC. Elaine Harper, my employment lawyer, would later underscore these points as central to our legal strategy. She identified that Martin's actions constituted multiple breaches: contractual violations, fiduciary duty neglect, and regulatory non-compliance. But perhaps Martin's gravest error was underestimating my awareness and preparedness. I had maintained detailed records and encrypted backups precisely because I understood the fragility of corporate promises and the potential for bad actors to exploit system dependencies. In essence, Martin's plan was flawed from the start. By prioritizing short-term financial optics over comprehensive risk assessment, he set the stage for operational failures and legal repercussions. His reliance on Derek Stanton, who lacked the required expertise, further magnified these vulnerabilities. Derek was left to learn on the job, but without access to the emergency files or full system diagrams, creating a blind spot that could and would cause critical breakdowns. As I pieced these facts together, it became clear that Martin saw me not as a professional asset, but as a liability to be removed with minimal fuss. The targeted elimination of vested employees like me was less about efficiency and more about financial expediency at the expense of legal and operational integrity. Yet, with the emergency file in my possession and my detailed documentation, I held a powerful counterbalance. This realization shaped my approach going forward. I knew that exposing Martin's oversights and the company's breaches would require a careful, evidence-driven strategy. Emotional responses had no place here. Only methodical, documented facts and legal precision could dismantle the facade. The emergency file was not just a repository of technical data. It was a shield protecting my rights and a sword to challenge the corporate misconduct unfolding under Martin's direction. The stakes were high, and the company's veneer of control was more fragile than it appeared. Martin's cost-cutting gambit had left gaps, both technical and legal, that I was prepared to exploit with unyielding professionalism. The battle lines were drawn, and I had the documentation and knowledge to pull the threads that Martin hoped would remain hidden. That evening, after leaving the building with the termination letter in hand, I sat down in my home office, ready to dissect the situation with the same precision I applied to system failures and architecture puzzles. The first step was to review the termination documents alongside my original employment contract, focusing specifically on the severance agreement. My contract was clear. After 15 years of continuous service, I was entitled to a severance package totaling $350,000. This clause wasn't a vague promise, it was a legally binding guarantee, explicitly detailed and signed by both myself and company representatives. Yet, the termination letter made no mention of any severance payout. In fact, it stated unequivocally that no severance would be provided. This was a red flag. To verify whether this omission was standard procedure or an intentional breach, I began to cross-reference the letter with prior company policies, employee handbooks, and historical precedent within Northgate Solutions. My findings were damning. The company had consistently honored severance agreements for other long-term employees, especially those with contractual guarantees like mine. This raised the clear possibility that the omission was deliberate, not accidental. To uncover the reasoning behind this, I pulled up my archived emails, particularly those exchanged between Martin Caldwell and other executives in the months leading to my termination. Using keyword filters such as severance, budget cuts, and employee reductions, I discovered an internal email chain that revealed a disturbing pattern. Martin had discussed strategies to avoid severance liabilities and restructure staff without triggering compensation clauses. Several messages outlined plans to classify terminations under budget cuts rather than layoffs to circumvent contractual penalties. One email explicitly advised HR to limit disclosure of severance obligations to minimize payout. The evidence pointed to a calculated effort to conceal severance commitments, violating not only internal policies, but also employment law, which mandates honoring contractual severance agreements unless mutually renegotiated. More alarmingly, the emails indicated an attempt to fast-track my replacement, Derek Stanton, without a proper knowledge transfer or access to critical system documentation, another breach of operational protocol I'd find concerning, given the proprietary nature of our systems. Turning back to the emergency file I maintained, I examined the system architecture diagrams and dependency matrices I had meticulously updated over the years. These documents mapped out the network infrastructure, illustrating how various subsystems interconnected and depended on proprietary software components I had designed. The diagrams clearly demonstrated that only I, and by extension the emergency file, held the complete knowledge needed to maintain system stability. Passing on this knowledge wasn't just a courtesy, it was essential for compliance with client service agreements and regulatory requirements mandating uninterrupted service during organizational transitions. Within the emergency file, I also located the latest versions of my contingency plans, which included documented access credentials, backup procedures, and escalation protocols. These had been updated as recently as 2 weeks before my termination. I noted that Derek Stanton had no formal access to these files, nor had he undergone any formal training on the system architectures. This omission significantly increased the risk of operational failures, which could breach service-level agreements with clients and trigger regulatory scrutiny. Digging deeper, I found internal memos and audit reports revealing irregularities in the merger process. Some communication suggested that the merger was expedited without satisfying all regulatory compliance checkpoints, particularly those related to employment contracts and intellectual property rights. There were memos highlighting concerns about potential contract conflicts, and non-disclosure of severance obligations, flagged by compliance officers but overridden by senior management. These lapses exposed Northgate to penalties from labor authorities and securities regulators, risks that Martin apparently downplayed or ignored. At this point, I systematically mapped out the violations I had uncovered. 1. Breach of contract. The unilateral denial of my severance payment despite a signed and enforceable agreement. 2. Concealment and fraud. Deliberate withholding of severance obligations from HR and management, evidenced by internal emails. 3. Operational risk. Failure to ensure knowledge transfer and access to critical system documentation for my replacement, jeopardizing client service continuity. 4. Regulatory non-compliance. Ignoring labor laws and securities regulations governing employee rights and merger disclosures, exposing the company to audits and penalties. Throughout this review, I maintained a calm, analytical mindset. There was no room for emotional reaction. This was a professional challenge demanding strategic response. I documented every discrepancy, saved copies of relevant emails, and time-stamped every file to build an airtight record. I also logged notes on compliance deadlines and potential audit triggers, knowing that regulatory bodies could be powerful allies if properly engaged. As the night deepened, I considered the implications. This wasn't just about recovering a severance payment. It was about holding the company accountable for a pattern of misconduct, risking client trust, employee rights, and regulatory compliance. The threads I had pulled so far revealed a web of intentional malfeasance. But to unravel the full scheme, I would need to proceed methodically, building a comprehensive dossier. This initial assessment was crucial. It set the foundation for a broader legal and professional campaign. With every document cross-checked and every email scrutinized, I was assembling the evidence necessary to confront the CFO's cost-cutting gambit. The emergency file, once a technical artifact, was now my leverage. The merger negotiations, the contractual breaches, and the concealed frauds were no longer invisible. I was poised to expose them through the rigorous, documented truth I had preserved. The situation remained precarious. I was no longer just an employee dismissed without cause. I was a custodian of critical knowledge and a witness to corporate malpractice. The next steps would require careful planning and expert legal guidance. But for now, the facts were clear, and the path forward began to take shape in the glow of my computer screen, precise, measured, and unyielding. After assembling this initial dossier, I recognized the necessity of professional legal counsel to navigate the complexity of corporate, employment, and securities law intertwined in my case. I scheduled a consultation with Elaine Harper, an employment and corporate law specialist recommended by a trusted industry contact. Given the stakes, contract breaches, regulatory infractions, and intellectual property concerns, I knew I needed an attorney who could help me leverage the extensive documentation I had compiled into a coherent legal strategy. The meeting with Elaine was thorough and focused. I presented the key pieces of evidence in an organized fashion: my signed employment contract, with the severance clause highlighted, the termination letter explicitly denying severance, internal email threads exposing deliberate concealment of severance obligations, and the emergency file containing proprietary system architecture diagrams, network dependency maps, and access logs. I also detailed the irregularities I'd uncovered in the merger process, especially those that risked non-compliance with employment and securities regulations. Elaine immediately recognized the significance of the evidence. She pointed out that the severance clause was a legally binding contractual obligation and that the company's denial could constitute a breach enforceable in court. More critically, she noted that the emails indicating a deliberate effort to conceal severance liabilities introduced a strong element of bad faith and potential fraud. From a regulatory standpoint, the merger's mishandling of employee contracts and intellectual property disclosures could attract scrutiny from both the Department of Labor and the Securities and Exchange Commission. Together, we catalogued every relevant document into a comprehensive evidence matrix. This included employment contracts and amendments, termination notices and HR communications, email exchanges between CFO Caldwell and senior management discussing severance strategies, emergency system documentation with dated version histories, internal memos and audit reports highlighting compliance concerns, witness statements from trusted colleagues who had observed unusual directives from the CFO regarding knowledge transfers and severance denials, recognizing the need for secure handling. I provided Elaine with encrypted copies of all files on a dedicated external drive, secured with multi-factor authentication. I also agreed to maintain strict chain of custody protocols for all documentation to preserve evidentiary integrity. Elaine stressed the importance of not engaging in any confrontations with company representatives without legal advice, advising me to direct all communications through her office moving forward. In parallel, I took additional steps to safeguard the technical assets under my control. I created encrypted backups of the emergency file and related system architecture materials, ensuring multiple copies were securely stored off-site. To bolster the case about operational risks from the transition, I reached out discreetly to a few trusted IT colleagues. I requested written, time-stamped statements, confirming that they had been instructed to withhold critical system documentation from Derek Stanton, and that the CFO imposed unusual constraints on knowledge transfers. These statements could corroborate the breach of standard operating procedures and highlight the increased risk to client services. Elaine and I also identified a crucial leverage point. The severance clause was linked to a non-compete agreement embedded in my contract. The CFO's decision to terminate me without honoring this clause potentially exposed the company to further legal jeopardy, as non-compete enforcement depends on providing contractually stipulated severance. This connection added weight to our argument and provided a tactical angle for negotiation and regulatory complaint filings. To structure our approach, we developed a detailed timeline outlining the sequence of events, from the merger announcement and internal communications to my termination and the subsequent knowledge transfer restrictions. This timeline was cross-referenced with regulatory deadlines related to employee protections during mergers and intellectual property disclosures. Elaine emphasized that this would be critical in demonstrating willful misconduct and regulatory violations during any formal investigation. Throughout this planning phase, I maintained disciplined documentation of all meetings, calls, and correspondence with Elaine, noting dates, participants, and key discussion points. I also reviewed my own records to ensure consistency in my statements and to anticipate potential counter-arguments from the company's legal team. Strategically, the plan was to use a multi-front approach, initiate formal complaints with labor authorities regarding severance denial and contractual breaches, prepare filings with the Securities and Exchange Commission addressing intellectual property misappropriation and merger disclosure violations, leverage client contracts requiring uninterrupted service to highlight operational risks caused by the company's knowledge transfer failures, build a professional narrative emphasizing my expertise, compliance adherence, and the company's disregard for legal obligations. I resolved to maintain professional composure in all interactions, avoiding any confrontational or emotional responses. Each step was calculated to increase pressure systematically, using the weight of documented facts and legal statutes rather than rhetoric. Elaine and I agreed that a gradual escalation, starting with demand letters and regulatory engagement, would maximize leverage while preserving options for negotiation or litigation. By the end of this phase, I felt a renewed sense of control. The seemingly arbitrary termination now had a clear legal and professional context, and I was prepared to respond with purpose and precision. The emergency file had transformed from a technical archive into a strategic asset, empowering me to expose the full scope of misconduct. The threads I had begun pulling were ready to unravel the flawed merger strategy, one documented fact at a time. Elaine's initial review of the evidence I provided was exhaustive and methodical. As an employment and corporate law specialist, she immediately identified multiple layers of legal violations embedded within the documents. The severance contract breach was the most straightforward. My signed employment agreement explicitly guaranteed a severance payment of $350,000 after 15 years of continuous service. The termination letter, however, denied this entitlement entirely. Elaine explained that this was not just a procedural oversight, but a clear contractual violation, which alone could form the basis of a formal claim for breach of contract. What deepened the gravity of the situation was the discovery of internal emails, where Martin Caldwell, the CFO, had strategized to conceal severance obligations from both HR and senior management. Elaine emphasized that these emails demonstrated bad faith conduct, potentially rising to fraudulent misrepresentation. By advising HR to classify terminations in a way that avoided triggering severance payouts, Martin knowingly undermined legally binding agreements. This pattern could expose the company not only to civil liability, but also regulatory sanctions for deceptive employment practices. Elaine also highlighted the issue of fiduciary duty failure. As CFO, Martin had obligations not only to shareholders, but also to employees and clients, especially during a merger. His deliberate sidelining of contractual commitments and operational protocols constituted a breach of fiduciary responsibility. This failure was particularly reckless, given the proprietary nature of the systems I maintained. The emergency file contained detailed system architecture diagrams, encrypted passwords, and contingency plans, the intellectual property underpinning over 60% of Northgate's operations. Martin's decision to fast-track my replacement without proper knowledge transfer disregarded the operational risks and client service continuity obligations, potentially exposing the company to breach of contract claims from clients. On the regulatory front, Elaine alerted me to several infractions tied to the merger approval process. The hastened restructuring had ignored mandatory disclosures related to employment contracts and intellectual property rights, which are required under both labor law and securities regulations. The failure to disclose severance obligations and the mismanagement of proprietary information during the merger could trigger investigations from the Department of Labor and the Securities and Exchange Commission. Elaine stressed that these regulatory bodies take such violations seriously, with penalties reaching into millions of dollars and lasting reputational damage. Together, we compiled a comprehensive evidence matrix that included my original employment contracts and amendments outlining severance and non-compete clauses, the termination letter explicitly denying severance, the incriminating internal emails between Martin and HR executives detailing severance avoidance strategies, emergency system documentation with version histories demonstrating the proprietary nature of the system knowledge I possessed, internal audit reports and memos noting compliance concerns about the merger's expedited process, witness statements from IT colleagues who observed unusual directives to withhold critical system knowledge from Derek Stanton. The witness statements were particularly valuable. Several trusted colleagues confirmed that Martin had imposed strict limitations on knowledge transfers during the transition. They also noted Martin's explicit instructions to avoid providing severance information or acknowledging contractual obligations. These statements qualified the technical and legal claims with first-hand professional observations, reinforcing the credibility and depth of the case. Elaine emphasized the importance of maintaining an unbroken chain of custody for all evidence. To that end, I provided her with encrypted copies of every relevant document on a secure external drive, ensuring multi-factor authentication and strict access controls. I also agreed to carefully document all communications with company representatives, HR personnel, and external parties to preserve a detailed, time-stamped record. She warned me against direct contact with the company without legal representation to avoid inadvertently weakening our position. To fortify the technical aspects of the case, I created redundant encrypted backups of the emergency file and all related system architecture materials, storing copies off-site. I coordinated with IT colleagues to corroborate operational risks caused by Derek Stanton's lack of access and training. Their technical analyses confirmed that without the emergency file's system diagrams and access credentials, the proprietary systems were vulnerable to failures and client service interruptions, breaches that could trigger contractual penalties. One key leverage point Elaine identified was the contractual linkage between severance payments and my non-compete clause. The contract stipulated that honoring severance was a prerequisite for enforcing non-compete conditions. Martin's refusal to pay severance effectively nullified his ability to enforce the non-compete, opening additional legal avenues. This connection allowed us to pressure the company on multiple fronts simultaneously: employment law, intellectual property rights, and client contract compliance. We constructed a detailed timeline delineating critical events: the merger announcement, internal communications about cost-cutting and severance avoidance, my termination, and the subsequent lack of knowledge transfer. This timeline was cross-referenced with statutory deadlines and regulatory requirements governing employee protections during corporate mergers. Elaine underscored that demonstrating willful disregard for these obligations was vital for escalating the case beyond civil claims into regulatory investigations. Throughout our collaboration, I maintained scrupulous records of every meeting, call, and correspondence with Elaine, noting participants' dates and salient points. I reviewed my documentation repeatedly to ensure consistency and preempt potential challenges from the company's legal defense. Our strategy focused on presenting a unified narrative: a seasoned professional unjustly terminated in violation of contract and law, with deliberate corporate misconduct, risking operational integrity and regulatory compliance. The plan was to pursue a multi-tiered approach: submit formal complaints to labor authorities for severance denial and breach of contract, file detailed reports with the SEC regarding misappropriation of proprietary information and merger disclosure violations, leverage client contracts requiring uninterrupted service to highlight the operational risks caused by the company's negligence, and prepare for potential civil litigation supported by both documentary and testimonial evidence. Elaine advised patience and professionalism, cautioning against overt confrontation. The goal was to escalate pressure systematically through legal and regulatory channels without provoking rash responses. The emergency file, once merely a technical safeguard, had become a strategic asset anchoring our case. By the end of this phase, the scope of violations and the strength of our evidence created a clear path forward. The company's legal exposure was significant, and the professional groundwork for accountability was set. The merger's veneer of control was compromised, and Martin's cost-cutting gambit was vulnerable to systematic dismantling through precise legal and technical leverage. The threads I had begun pulling were now supported by expert legal counsel and a robust dossier, ready to unravel the corporate misconduct hiding in plain sight. After Elaine and I finalized our strategy, the first concrete steps kicked off with the formal delivery of legal notices and regulatory complaints. I retained the utmost professionalism in every interaction, understanding that maintaining a composed demeanor was critical to preserving credibility and avoiding reactive pitfalls. Elaine prepared precise demand letters detailing the company's contractual breaches, regulatory violations, and the operational risks jeopardizing client services. These letters were sent to Northgate's HR department, legal team, and executive management, formally initiating the process without any public dramatics. Simultaneously, Elaine filed complaints with the Department of Labor and the Securities and Exchange Commission, meticulously referencing the severance denial, misappropriation of intellectual property, and failure to disclose material information during the merger. Each filing was supported by the encrypted evidence matrix we had assembled: contracts, emails, memos, emergency system files, and witness statements. The regulatory agencies acknowledged receipt and assigned case numbers, signaling that our complaints had moved beyond preliminary claims to formal inquiries. While the formal legal machinery began turning, I recognized the delicate balance required in internal communications. Despite the tension, I maintained measured, professional exchanges with HR and management. In all correspondence and meetings, I refrained from divulging strategic details or expressing frustration. Instead, I focused on procedural compliance, requesting proper documentation of my termination, providing requested exit paperwork, and responding succinctly to standard inquiries. This approach ensured there was no cause for the company to claim unprofessional conduct on my part, reinforcing the legitimacy of my position. Parallel to this, I discreetly reached out to key clients with whom I had long-standing relationships, project managers and technical leads I trusted. Without revealing confidential details or legal tactics, I conveyed that there were potential risks to uninterrupted service due to recent management changes affecting system oversight. My message was carefully crafted to emphasize my concern for continuity and quality, not to alarm or undermine Northgate publicly. I documented all correspondence, mindful that transparency with clients might protect both their interests and lend further weight to our case by demonstrating the practical ramifications of internal mismanagement. Understanding the financial implications of an extended dispute, I took proactive steps to secure my personal stability. Through professional networks, I negotiated a consulting contract with a reputable competitor in the IT systems architecture field. This arrangement was confidential and structured to avoid conflicts of interest, ensuring I remained professionally engaged and financially secure while the legal process unfolded. Elaine advised that this move not only provided personal security, but also underscored my ongoing market value, countering any narrative that I was dispensable or obsolete. Meanwhile, within Northgate, Martin Caldwell seemed unaware of the full scope of the challenge now emerging. Confident in his cost-cutting success, he continued onboarding Derek Stanton as my replacement. Derek, however, struggled with the proprietary system's complexities, particularly given his lack of access to the emergency files and my detailed system documentation. Reports from trusted contacts indicated increased system instability and delayed responses to client issues, but Martin appeared focused on short-term savings rather than these warning signs. Throughout this period, I rigorously completed all exit-related documentation, returning company property, and complying with requests punctually. I remained calm and factual in all communications, responding only to procedural queries, and declining to engage in any debate or discussion about my termination or the evolving legal matters. Every phone call, email, and meeting was logged with timestamps and descriptions, creating a comprehensive record of interactions that could support potential claims of bad faith or harassment should the company attempt to intimidate or discredit me. The calculated restraint in my conduct was deliberate. I wanted to avoid any hint of personal vendetta or emotional reaction that could be exploited against me. Instead, my goal was to create a stark contrast between my professionalism and the company's growing legal exposure. The groundwork was laid, the formal notices served, and the regulatory complaints lodged. Behind the scenes, the mechanisms of accountability were now activated. Unbeknownst to Martin and the company's leadership, the trap had been set with precision. The combination of legal pressure, regulatory scrutiny, client awareness, and technical vulnerabilities surrounding Derek's inexperience formed a multi-front challenge that was steadily closing in. The next phases of this process would bring consequences that could no longer be contained or ignored. But at this stage, outward appearances remained deceptively calm, with all parties maintaining the facade of routine business amid an undercurrent of impending disruption. Within a few weeks after my termination, the cracks in Northgate's system architecture became increasingly visible. Derek Stanton, stepping into a role I had refined over nearly 2 decades, faced challenges that were both predictable and severe. Without access to the detailed emergency file I had maintained, complete with comprehensive system diagrams, dependency charts, and critical passwords, he was navigating blind in a labyrinth of proprietary infrastructure. The consequences surfaced quickly. Cascading system failures emerged, triggering client complaints and operational delays that put project deadlines and service-level agreements at risk. These failures weren't merely technical glitches, they were symptomatic of a deeper operational fragility created by a hasty, underinformed knowledge transfer. Multiple clients reported disruptions in their workflows that negatively impacted their business operations. I maintained a discreet but ongoing dialogue with trusted contacts among these clients, who confirmed that Northgate's response times had deteriorated and that critical systems were increasingly unstable. The irony was palpable. The budget cuts that precipitated my termination now jeopardized the very client relationships I had worked so hard to build and preserve. Meanwhile, regulatory agencies began to take notice. Following the formal complaints Elaine had filed with the Department of Labor and the Securities and Exchange Commission, I received confirmation that both bodies had opened inquiries into Northgate's practices. The Department of Labor was examining the severance denials and potential breaches of employment contracts, while the SEC focused on the merger disclosures and the mishandling of proprietary intellectual property. These investigations introduced a new layer of pressure on the company's leadership, as regulatory oversight threatened to escalate into formal penalties and public scrutiny. As the operational turmoil unfolded, Martin Caldwell's office became inundated with urgent communications. High-level clients demanded explanations for the deteriorating service quality and sought assurances about the continuity of their contractual agreements. Martin's initial confidence gave way to visible agitation as calls and emails piled up, exposing the gap between his cost-cutting strategy and the realities of system management. In a marked shift, he reached out directly to me, requesting consulting assistance to help mitigate the system issues and proposing settlement discussions to resolve outstanding disputes quietly. I approached these overtures with professional detachment. Adhering strictly to the advice Elaine had given me, I declined to engage directly in any informal negotiations or technical support. Instead, I directed all communications to my legal counsel, reinforcing the boundary between the company and myself. Every request, proposal, or inquiry from Martin was logged meticulously, with copies forwarded to Elaine to maintain a precise record of interactions. This documentation would later prove invaluable in demonstrating the company's recognition of liability and their attempt to manage the fallout discreetly. Behind the scenes, the mounting internal audits began to expose financial discrepancies linked to the cost-cutting measures Martin had implemented. These audits revealed irregular accounting practices and unreported liabilities, particularly relating to severance obligations and contractual commitments. Coupled with the operational failures and the regulatory inquiries, the evidence mounted steadily against the CFO's aggressive restructuring plan. Despite the growing pressure, Martin publicly maintained a narrative of success, touting cost savings and efficiency gains. However, the foundation of this narrative was crumbling. The merger's operational stability was compromised, client trust was eroding, and regulatory agencies were scrutinizing practices once concealed behind corporate facades. The company was caught in a tightening noose of its own making. Throughout this period, I preserved my professional composure, ensuring that every interaction was measured and every step was documented. I continued to provide Elaine with updates and copies of incoming communications, reinforcing our comprehensive evidence base. My strategic restraint underscored the contrast between my methodical approach and the company's increasingly reactive stance. In essence, the consequences of Martin's miscalculations began to unfold with unambiguous clarity. The technical failures, client dissatisfaction, regulatory scrutiny, and financial irregularities converged into a multifaceted crisis that could no longer be ignored or managed through silence and obfuscation. The company's veneer of control was deteriorating rapidly, setting the stage for the next phase of engagement where legal and professional pressures would intensify. The situation remained volatile, with the balance tipping steadily away from the CFO's cost-cutting gambit toward a reckoning grounded in documented fact and strategic persistence. The moment we filed the lawsuit marked a critical turning point, not just a formal step, but the opening salvo in a complex professional confrontation. Elaine and I had carefully crafted the complaint to cite explicit breaches of contract and detailed instances of regulatory violations. Every allegation was backed by the meticulously preserved documentation: my signed employment contract guaranteeing severance, the termination letter denying it, the internal email correspondence revealing deliberate concealment of severance obligations, and the emergency files demonstrating the proprietary system knowledge mishandled by the company. This wasn't a case built on conjecture, but on irrefutable, traceable evidence. Almost immediately, the Securities and Exchange Commission intensified its investigations. Their focus extended beyond mere employment disputes to the broader implications of merger misrepresentations and intellectual property mishandling. The SEC's inquiry demanded thorough disclosure from Northgate's leadership, scrutinizing internal communications, financial statements, and compliance reports. This escalation added significant pressure on Martin Caldwell and the executive team, whose prior attempts to circumvent contractual and regulatory responsibilities were now under formal external review. Simultaneously, I observed a gradual but unmistakable shift in client behavior. Key accounts that I had personally nurtured for years began to issue notices of concern or delay contract renewals. These clients, relying heavily on the proprietary systems I had designed and maintained, were experiencing operational disruptions stemming from incomplete knowledge transfer and inadequate system management. Without the emergency file and my oversight, the network architecture suffered cascading failures, delays in response times, data bottlenecks, and intermittent outages that directly impacted business-critical operations. These incidents were not isolated. They formed a pattern that clients could not ignore. Aware of the growing dissatisfaction, Martin attempted damage control. He reached out to me under the guise of requesting consulting assistance, presumably hoping to leverage my expertise to stabilize the failing systems quietly. His proposal also included initial overtures toward settlement discussions, aiming to resolve disputes discreetly before they escalated further. I recognized these overtures for what they were: attempts to manage reputational risk and mitigate regulatory fallout without admitting liability. Following Elaine's guidance, I responded with professional detachment and clear boundaries. Every communication was directed back through my legal counsel, explicitly declining informal negotiations or technical support. This approach served multiple purposes. It preserved the integrity of our legal position, documented the company's recognition of the issues, and prevented any inadvertent weakening of my claims. Each piece of correspondence was logged, time-stamped, and securely archived, adding another layer of evidence to our growing dossier. Behind the scenes, internal audits began unearthing financial irregularities linked to Martin's cost-cutting strategies. These audits confirmed discrepancies in severance accounting and revealed attempts to mask liabilities associated with contractual obligations. The pattern of concealment identified in the emails was corroborated by these findings, exposing a systemic effort to sidestep employee rights and regulatory standards. As client complaints mounted and regulatory inquiries deepened, Martin found himself increasingly isolated. His public narrative of successful cost savings and operational efficiency started to unravel. The mounting evidence of operational disruptions, contractual breaches, and financial mismanagement eroded confidence within the executive ranks and among shareholders. Yet despite internal alarms, Northgate's leadership publicly maintained a facade of stability, carefully avoiding acknowledgement of ongoing investigations and client dissatisfaction. Throughout this turbulent period, I remained unwaveringly professional. I continued to complete all required exit documentation with precision and responded to procedural inquiries without divulging strategic intentions. Maintaining a composed demeanor was essential. It contrasted starkly with the company's destabilizing crisis and reinforced my credibility should the proceedings advance to litigation or regulatory hearings. The culmination of these developments was clear. The merger's foundation was shifting under the weight of documented evidence and escalating consequences. Technical failures exposed operational vulnerabilities, client attrition raised financial alarms, regulatory probes threatened substantial penalties, and internal audits revealed breaches of fiduciary duty. The multi-front pressure was closing in systematically. At this stage, the situation was volatile, but far from resolved. Martin's short-sighted cost-cutting gambit, predicated on ignoring contractual and regulatory frameworks, was unraveling. The documented evidence and professional strategy Elaine and I had deployed ensured that the company could no longer contain the fallout. The next phases, intensified legal actions, client contract terminations, and regulatory sanctions, were imminent, setting the stage for a comprehensive reckoning. Yet through it all, my focus remained on measured professionalism and strategic patience. The threads I pulled had begun to unravel the corporate misconduct, but the battle required sustained diligence. This was not about personal vindication alone. It was about enforcing accountability through systems of law, documentation, and professional standards. The corporate facade was cracking, but the story was still unfolding. Martin Caldwell's termination was the first unmistakable sign that the consequences of the mounting scandal were real and unavoidable. The board, under increasing pressure from shareholders and regulators, moved decisively to remove him as CFO. Internal investigations revealed his central role in orchestrating the severance avoidance scheme and the deliberate mismanagement of proprietary intellectual property during the merger. This wasn't merely a personnel shakeup. It was an acknowledgement that his actions exposed Northgate Solutions to serious legal, financial, and reputational risks. The financial repercussions for Northgate quickly escalated. Regulatory agencies, including the Department of Labor and the SEC, imposed multi-million-dollar fines for breaches related to employment contracts, fraudulent concealment of severance obligations, and failure to properly disclose intellectual property assets during the merger process. The $8.5 million SEC penalty, in particular, sent shockwaves through the company's leadership and the broader market. These sanctions weren't abstract figures. They directly impacted Northgate's financial statements, eroding investor confidence and destabilizing the company's market standing. Simultaneously, the operational failures that had begun under Derek Stanton's management intensified. Without access to the emergency files and lacking my institutional knowledge, Derek struggled to maintain system stability. Client-facing teams reported escalating issues, unplanned outages, delayed incident responses, and missed service-level agreements. These issues translated into a growing wave of client dissatisfaction. Key accounts, some responsible for generating millions annually, initiated contract reviews, withholding renewals or outright terminating agreements. The combination of regulatory fines and client exodus created a liquidity crisis threatening Northgate's very survival. Against this backdrop, additional whistleblowers came forward. Several former and current employees corroborated the pattern of wrongful terminations and deliberate financial misrepresentations orchestrated by Martin and the senior management team. Their testimonies, documented through formal statements and internal communications, revealed systemic efforts to circumvent contractual obligations and inflate cost savings figures. These revelations compounded regulatory scrutiny and invited further investigations, especially concerning corporate governance and fiduciary duties. Industry publications and analysts began spotlighting Northgate's unraveling merger saga. Articles detailed the legal battles, operational breakdowns, and financial penalties, framing the case as a cautionary example of the risks companies face when prioritizing short-term cost-cutting over compliance and due diligence. The negative press amplified stakeholder concerns, accelerating client departures and complicating efforts to stabilize the business. Throughout this turmoil, I maintained a strategic approach to advancing my claims. My legal team and I negotiated from a position of strength, supported by the comprehensive evidence gathered over months. The severance package originally promised $350,000 was augmented by damages for breach of contract, bad faith conduct, and emotional distress tied to the professional betrayal I endured. After careful deliberation, I secured a settlement exceeding $600,000, including coverage for legal fees. This outcome reflected not only financial restitution, but also formal recognition of the wrongs perpetrated against me. The fallout extended beyond financial terms. The merger was ultimately dissolved, reverting Northgate to an independent operational state. Regulatory sanctions mandated structural reforms, strengthening compliance protocols, revising severance policies, and instituting transparent governance measures. These changes aimed to prevent recurrence of the abuses I had exposed and to restore client and investor trust. The company's leadership was overhauled, with a renewed emphasis on ethical management and legal adherence. At a personal and professional level, the experience fortified my resolve and underscored the vital importance of rigorous documentation and methodical strategic planning. By combining technical expertise with legal acumen, I transformed a sudden and unfair termination into a catalyst for accountability and systemic reform. The resolution wasn't a matter of retribution, but of ensuring that corporate misconduct faced consequences proportionate to its impact on employees, clients, and the market. The wider industry took notice. Northgate's case became a touchstone in professional circles, referenced in seminars, compliance training, and legal forums as an example of how detailed documentation and measured legal strategy can effectively challenge corporate malfeasance. My role as a senior IT professional who leveraged system knowledge and contractual rights to hold leadership accountable inspired other employees facing similar challenges to document diligently and seek counsel. As the dust settled, the professional landscape had shifted. Martin's dismissal, the financial penalties, client departures, and regulatory mandates collectively marked a pivotal moment in Northgate's history, one defined by the consequences of prioritizing expedient cost-cutting over lawful, ethical corporate stewardship. The company's survival depended on embracing these lessons and rebuilding on foundations of transparency and respect for contractual obligations. Yet the story at this stage was far from over. The structural reforms and reputational repairs required ongoing vigilance. While I had secured a favorable settlement and contributed to systemic change, the broader implications for Northgate's future viability remained uncertain. The corporate ecosystem was still grappling with the aftershocks of the scandal, and the professional community watched closely as the company endeavored to regain stability. In this complex environment, I continued to focus on professionalism, preparing for any further legal or regulatory developments. The detailed documentation that had served me so well remained an active resource, ready to support continued accountability efforts, if necessary. The corporate betrayal I endured became a case study in how calm, calculated professionalism and strategic use of evidence can dismantle entrenched misconduct, not through drama or confrontation, but through mastery of facts and systems. The repercussions of Martin Caldwell's actions extended well beyond individual consequences, reshaping Northgate's operational and governance landscape. His termination amid scandal was both a personal reckoning and a corporate turning point. The multi-million-dollar fines, client exodus, and whistleblower revelations exposed systemic vulnerabilities and prompted industry-wide conversations on ethical management during mergers. While the crisis threatened bankruptcy, the enforced reforms laid groundwork for future resilience, underscoring that professional integrity, when combined with strategic documentation, holds the power to challenge and change even the most entrenched corporate failures. The court proceedings proceeded with a precision that mirrored my own approach to the entire ordeal. Every piece of evidence Elaine and I had painstakingly gathered, the contracts, emails, system diagrams, witness statements, and regulatory filings, was presented clearly and methodically. The judge's scrutiny was thorough, focusing on the documented breach of contract that denied me the severance I was legally entitled to after 17 years of dedicated service. The contract was unequivocal, and the internal communications revealed the deliberate concealment orchestrated by Martin Caldwell and his team. The court awarded me $620,000, which encompassed the full severance amount, punitive damages acknowledging the company's bad faith conduct, and coverage of my legal fees. This verdict was grounded not in emotion, but in the incontrovertible facts and professional documentation that underpinned the case. Parallel to the civil suit, the Securities and Exchange Commission intensified its investigation into Northgate Solutions. Their inquiry centered on the misrepresentation of merger disclosures and the mishandling of proprietary intellectual property, specifically the emergency files and system architecture documentation that formed the backbone of the company's operational infrastructure. The SEC concluded that Northgate had failed to disclose critical severance obligations and had attempted to appropriate proprietary knowledge without proper compensation or transparency, violating securities regulations designed to protect shareholders and employees during mergers. These findings culminated in a substantial fine of $5 million imposed on Northgate, a penalty that underscored the gravity of the regulatory breaches and sent a clear message about corporate governance accountability. Martin Caldwell, whose decisions had triggered this cascade of consequences, faced direct professional repercussions. The board terminated his employment amidst the scandal, citing gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. More significantly, regulators moved to suspend his professional license as a certified financial officer, effectively barring him from holding similar positions in the near future. This disciplinary action was based on documented proof of his orchestrated attempts to bypass contractual severance obligations, conceal financial liabilities, and mishandle intellectual property, actions that compromised not only employee rights, but also investor confidence. The fallout extended beyond regulatory and legal sanctions. The operational disruptions caused by the absence of proper knowledge transfer and the unauthorized replacement of experienced staff with underqualified personnel like Derek Stanton accelerated. Multiple key clients, some contributing millions annually, formally terminated contracts or refused to renew, citing repeated service failures and breaches of confidentiality agreements. This client exodus compounded Northgate's financial instability, forcing the company into a rapid restructuring phase to address both operational deficits and reputational damage. Amid this turmoil, a number of whistleblowers emerged within Northgate's ranks, providing corroborative evidence of a broader pattern of wrongful terminations and financial misappropriation. Their testimonies, coupled with internal audit reports, exposed systemic issues of governance failure and unethical cost-cutting measures that had been overlooked or concealed by senior management. The amplified scrutiny from both inside and outside the organization intensified pressure on the company to reform its practices and rebuild trust with stakeholders. Industry analysts and professional publications took note of the case's implications. Northgate Solutions became a widely cited example in discussions about the risks companies face when prioritizing short-term financial gains over regulatory compliance and ethical treatment of employees. The case was referenced in legal seminars, compliance forums, and corporate governance workshops as a cautionary tale illustrating how detailed documentation, contractual vigilance, and strategic legal action can hold even powerful executives accountable. This recognition extended my professional standing from a mere former employee to a model of disciplined resistance against corporate malpractice. Negotiations to resolve my personal claims were conducted with the same strategic rigor applied throughout the process. The settlement exceeded initial contractual severance expectations, totaling over $600,000 and including compensation for damages incurred due to the company's bad faith actions. Legal fees and associated costs were fully covered, ensuring that the financial burden of pursuit did not fall on me. This outcome not only provided restitution, but also served as a formal acknowledgement of the wrongs I endured and the professional integrity I maintained. Beyond monetary outcomes, the merger itself unraveled and was ultimately dissolved. Regulatory mandates required Northgate to implement structural reforms encompassing stricter adherence to employment contract enforcement, enhanced transparency in intellectual property handling, and reinforced compliance protocols during corporate acquisitions. These reforms, monitored by external auditors, aimed to prevent recurrence of the systemic issues my case had exposed and to restore confidence among clients, employees, and investors. On a personal level, the experience fortified my conviction that professionalism and strategic documentation are essential defenses against corporate overreach. The ordeal underscored the critical importance of maintaining comprehensive records, understanding contractual obligations, and exercising measured patience in pursuit of justice. Rather than succumbing to emotional impulses, I relied on fact-based evidence and legal channels to transform a professional betrayal into an opportunity to influence corporate accountability and reform. The industry impact of the case extended further. I secured intellectual property rights for the proprietary systems I had designed, licensing them to competitors and thus reinforcing the tangible value of my technical contributions. My story became a reference point for IT professionals and corporate employees confronting similar challenges, emphasizing that meticulous documentation and legal preparedness can shift power dynamics in disputes with management. As Northgate rebuilt, incorporating recommendations and regulatory oversight, the legacy of this episode remained a defining moment in corporate governance discourse. The case demonstrated that even entrenched executives are not immune to consequences when confronted with verified evidence and persistent professional challenge. It reaffirmed the principle that the rule of law, supported by detailed documentation and strategic legal advocacy, is a fundamental safeguard for employee rights and organizational integrity. While the litigation and regulatory processes concluded with significant victories and reforms, the professional landscape continued to evolve. Northgate's restructuring opened opportunities for new leadership to prioritize ethical management and compliance, signaling a shift towards sustainable corporate practices. My role in catalyzing this change underscored the power of strategic professionalism and served as a lasting reminder that diligence and integrity can prevail over expedient but unlawful corporate tactics. Today, I lead a thriving IT consultancy specializing in system architecture and network infrastructure optimization. After nearly 2 decades confined within a single corporate environment, I now enjoy the professional freedom to apply my expertise across diverse industries. My consultancy's client portfolio includes several mid-sized technology firms and startups where I implement scalable, secure architectures designed to meet rigorous compliance standards I fought to uphold during my time at Northgate Solutions. My annual income has increased by 35%, reflecting both the premium value of my specialized knowledge and the entrepreneurial risks I've embraced. Beyond direct consulting fees, I hold equity stakes in several emerging tech companies, a strategic move to diversify income streams and remain actively engaged in cutting-edge innovation. The settlement I secured funded the launch of this venture, providing the initial capital necessary to assemble a lean expert team and invest in advanced tools for system modeling and security audits. Unlike my previous role, where my work was often constrained by corporate bureaucracy and opaque decision-making, I now enjoy direct control over project priorities and client engagement strategies. This autonomy allows me to implement best practices and maintain uncompromising standards in documentation and operational transparency, principles I learned to value profoundly through my ordeal. Reflecting on the entire experience, I recognize that unwavering commitment to meticulous documentation was pivotal. The emergency file I maintained at Northgate, a comprehensive, encrypted dossier that included system architecture blueprints, dependency maps, access credentials, and contingency protocols, proved to be an irreplaceable strategic asset. It transformed from a technical safeguard into a foundational pillar of my legal and professional defense. Without this level of detailed, systematically updated documentation, exposing the company's contractual breaches and operational negligence would have been significantly more challenging. Equally critical was my mastery of contractual terms, especially severance agreements and non-compete clauses, and an acute awareness of regulatory requirements surrounding employment and mergers. These legal nuances are often overlooked by technical professionals, but proved essential leverage points. Partnering with Elaine Harper, my employment lawyer, fortified my strategy by translating these complex legal elements into actionable claims supported by evidence. Together, we navigated a multi-layered legal landscape, deploying complaints to labor authorities and the SEC, and positioning our case to exert maximum pressure without compromising professionalism. However, the most profound lesson was the power of strategic patience and calm professionalism. Throughout the ordeal, I maintained composure, avoiding emotional reactions or confrontational tactics. I understood that an evidence-based, methodical approach would yield far more sustainable outcomes than personal vendettas or public outbursts. This mindset ensured every communication was purposeful, every document preserved, and every step aligned toward constructive resolution. The transformation from a blindsided employee to a respected consultant and industry voice underscores the value of resilience blended with strategic foresight. My case has become a reference within professional circles, illustrating how detailed records and legal literacy empower individuals facing corporate adversity. It also serves as a cautionary tale to companies about the risks of overlooking contractual obligations and the operational perils of underestimating institutional knowledge. Today, I enjoy greater work-life balance and professional fulfillment. The experience has deepened my appreciation for the structures, contracts, documentation, legal frameworks that protect competent workers. My reputation now rests on competence, integrity, and strategic acumen rather than transient office politics or emotional responses. The journey reinforced that justice is achieved not through drama, but through systems of law, evidence, and patient professionalism.